with Ambassador Ashok Kantha, one of India's foremost experts on China. He has been India's ambassador to China, as well as High Commissioner to Malaysia and to Sri Lanka. He's also been director of the Institute for Chinese Studies, which is India's foremost think tank on China studies. And I'm Jyoti Malhotra from Awa South Asia. And today we're talking about the situation in Ladakh on the line of actual control. It's been nearly 4 years since Chinese troops moved on the LAC, which is the line of actual control. But welcome, Ambassador Kantha. And my first question to you is, what is the situation like today on the LAC in Ladakh?
Thank you, Jyoti. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me for this conversation. As you mentioned, this is fourth year since we had, the standoff situation in Eastern Ladakh beginning April, May 2020. Yeah. You would recall that at point of time, Chinese forces changed the status quo at multiple locations in Eastern Ladakh. They also inducted a large number of troops in that area. There was counter-deployment by us, and it led to later, a clash in the Galwan Valley on the night of 15-16 June 2020. And situation along the border became very abnormal. Since then, there have been discussions between two sides through both the diplomatic and military channels. As a result of these discussions, a modicum of disengagement has been reached at the 5 so-called friction points, northern and southern banks of Pangkung Lake, in Galwan Valley, Hot Spring, and Gogra. But this is not restoration of status quo ante because no buffer zones have been created, which has affected patrolling by troops to areas they visited earlier.
So let me just interrupt you here, Ambassador Kantha. Sorry, when you say buffer zones have been created, where are these buffer zones?
Details have not been made public, so specifics we don't know. But we understand that in all these areas, the buffer zones have been created. That means the areas which were patrolling earlier, our troops don't have access any longer. Apart from that, in two pockets, in Depsang Plains and Demchok areas, Chinese have not agreed to any disengagement. In Depsang Plains, for instance, there were at least 5 patrolling points that we're visiting, and we are not being allowed to go to those points. Likewise, in Demchok, we were going up to Chadingla, which is not accessible to our troops any longer. And also in terms of troop deployment, we have a situation which much higher level of deployment on both sides. Both sides have inducted, military hardware. Situation as Chief Army Staff General Manoj Pandey described in a media interaction on 11th of January is stable yet sensitive. Our External Affairs Minister has repeatedly mentioned that the situation along the borders is abnormal, and he has made the point that until normalcy is restored along the borders, it will be difficult to bring overall relations back to the normal track. So we are still in a period of transition in a difficult and abnormal situation, both in terms of the situation in border areas and the state of relations between India and China, which remains a low point.
So 2 questions, Ambassador Kantha. The first is when you say that Indian troops are not being allowed to patrol these areas where they patrolled before, including in the buffer zones. What does that mean? I don't understand. Are these buffer zones inside Indian territory within the LAC or the line of actual control, which is within India's control?
Jyoti, as I mentioned, details of understandings reached between corps commanders of two sides have not been made public. But from what we understand, these buffer zones straddle our line of actual control as per our perception. So, part of the buffer zone includes areas on our side that we're patrolling earlier and we are unable to patrol any longer.
But why not?
Besides,
Why are you unable to patrol? Is it that Chinese troops are physically stopping you from patrolling?
yes, it's an understanding reached to create a zone of separation between troops of two sides, so that there are no inadvertent clashes. Because the deployment remains at a relatively high level. There has not been any induction of troops. As Army Chief mentioned on 11th January, they can be true production only after the restoration of status quo ante as of mid 2020, more precisely April 2020. Now that situation has not been reached. So clearly, it will not be advisable for us to reduce our deployment. And Chinese also remained, deployed in fairly large numbers. Besides, on Chinese side, we have seen very frenetic activities regarding buildup of infrastructure, including capability to keep troops deployed on a long-term basis. They're adding, new accommodation. They're adding new roads, railway links. We have also taken, actions on our side, but the infrastructure along the border areas remained heavily in favor of China, and that gap, in fact, is still increasing.
So these railway links and this border infrastructure that you're talking about on the Chinese side, are you saying that they are building up on their own side of the line of actual control and that they're actually trying to bring the railway right up to the LAC?
Jyoti, a number of roads are being constructed. Most important is G695, which will be, in Aksai Chin area, very close to line of actual control. This will be in addition to highway they had constructed in the 1950s. Then there are, developing three railway links. One railway link will be up to Ningchi, which is opposite, Arunachal Pradesh in the eastern sector. Second railway link will come up to Yatung in Chumbi Valley, and the third railway link will go up to a place called Gerong along Nepal-China border. So these, developments, along with the activation of very large number of airfields in both Tibet and Xinjiang, and other infrastructure building activities, will substantially increase China's capability to induct additional troops and keep them deployed even during winter months. Therefore, what we have now is a fundamentally changed situation. The nature of border between India and China, which had remained essentially peaceful for nearly three decades, even though there were occasional standoff situations, had changed. Now the borders, they become live. With, as I mentioned earlier, with relatively high level of deployment on both sides. So it's not a normal situation. Though Chinese would like us to accept the altered, changed status quo as the new normal and move on. They would like us to resume our normal engagement in other areas of India-China relations, a position we have not accepted. In fact, our External Affairs Minister has repeatedly ruled out that option.
So you seem really concerned, Ambassador Kantha, which is, I suppose, every Indian citizen should be concerned. So are you then saying a couple of things? The first is that around the year now, the Chinese are, they have their troops stationed on the line of actual control all the way from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh. So in a sense, you're being, you have pressure right along your northern boundary.
Jyoti, level of deployment in different areas is different. It's not that they are deployed right up to line of actual control in all sectors. Okay. But they have built up capabilities over the years to to induct forces all along the line of actual control. And you'd recall that in December 2020, they tried to change the status quo in the Yangtze area, in Tawang subsector of eastern sector, though we managed to foil that attempt. So in our preparedness, we have to bear in mind the risk that Chinese would try to engage in salami slicing activities, as they have done in the Western sector. So other sectors as well, we had to sort of step up deployment, and we are in a more robust operational posture, as General Manoj Pandey mentioned in his media interaction 11th January.
So, what is this new normal that you're describing, and how different is it from the old normal?
New normal is a situation which the Chinese have created uh, after incursions at multiple locations in eastern Ladakh. So they have essentially changed the status quo. There have been some disengagement following talks between corps commanders at 5 so-called friction points, as I mentioned earlier. But even at those friction points, there has not been restoration of status quo ante. As Army Chief mentioned, what we are seeking is restoration of status quo ante as of April, May 2020. It may not happen entirely because, as I mentioned earlier, nature of border has changed. There is greater deployment from both sides. And I think we would also be reluctant to de-induct forces at a time when there is a deep mistrust and distrust between two sides. But what we are trying to achieve is to see that patrolling is restored. As it was in April, May 2020, which was disturbed as a result of Chinese incursions. So that should be our objective. So we cannot accept the altered status quo that the Chinese have created through unilateral action, because that is in violation of all understandings reached between India and China since 1993, Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement.
But Ambassador, to me, it seems as if this is more than a situation, a military situation on the border or a security-related tension. It seems to me that this is also a political development, isn't it? For the last 3.5 years, nearly 4 years now, India and China have been eyeball to eyeball on the LAC. But how would you describe this politically? What did the Chinese want? And what is India prepared to do?
Jyoti, you have rightly pointed out that it's not just a question of some developments along the line of actual control, even though those developments are very serious. They are structural problems in India-China relations. And the trigger point was what happened in eastern Ladakh in April, May, June 2020, especially the clash in Galwan Valley, which led to casualties on both sides. For the first time, we had casualties along India-China borders since 1975. So that has led to very serious, downturn in India-China relations. We are trying to deal with this problem through engagement at diplomatic and military levels. But I think we need to take perhaps a more broad view of the problem. It is not sufficient to engage at the level of corps commanders. There is need for return to the earlier pattern of discussing these issues through composite delegations of diplomatic and military officials, which will take into account a broader strategic context to the relationship. You can't deal with this problem and find resolution only in terms of disengagement or de-escalation of troops. We have a bigger issue, a bigger problem in India-China relations, which needs to be addressed both at the political level and through diplomatic and military interactions.
So, what is this bigger problem in India-China relations that needs to be addressed in a larger strategic context?
There are a whole lot of issues which are there. First are strategic outlooks and intentions are quite divergent. China is increasingly looking at the relations with India through prism of its strategic rivalry with the USA. The dominant view in China appears to be that India has joined the USA in its Indo-Pacific strategy, which they believe is to contain China. Then we feel that this assessment is not correct because we have maintained our agency and strategic autonomy. We also believe that China is not at all supportive of rise of India. There are a whole lot of other issues which are there, ranging from unresolved boundary question to tensions along the line of actual control to huge imbalance in India-China trade to our concerns that in our shared periphery, both land and maritime, China is trying to undermine our position. It's trying not just influence, but it's seeking strategic dominance, which will not be acceptable to us. So finally, it boils down to this challenge: how do we manage simultaneous rise of India and China, especially under the conditions of asymmetry in capabilities of two countries and the reluctance of China to accept India as an equal partner?
Mazda, you're suggesting a larger conversation than just the de-escalation or the or returning to the status quo ante. But I would imagine that the special representatives on both sides, an institution that has been in force since 2003 when former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee went to Beijing, and this so these SRs, these special representatives, wouldn't they be talking about something exactly like what you're suggesting?
As you know, there has not been, any dialogue of special representatives recently. There have been some discussions between our external affairs minister and national security advisor with foreign minister Wang and earlier foreign minister Chin Kang. I'm not saying that these discussions have not been productive, but what we need today is a more structured conversation with China. While the position we have taken that we cannot restore normalcy in overall relations until border areas become more peaceful, more normal, that's a very valid position we have taken. But how to arrive at that situation, I believe that depending excessively on dialogue between corps commanders, though that has been useful, no doubt about it. There have been 20 meetings between corps commanders. I think we need to broaden this dialogue. The heavy lifting will have perhaps will have to be done by at the political level and seen at diplomatic level rather than primarily at the level of corps commanders and through the mechanism of WMCC.
Right. That's really interesting, Ambassador, that you're talking about broadening the conversation and having a much more larger dialogue, a political diplomatic dialogue as well. My question to you is that, you've been an expert in China for decades. You were a diplomat when the Wangdung Sumdorong Chu incident happened in the late 1980s when Rajiv Gandhi was prime minister, 1987, if I'm right. Can you give us a brief idea of what happened then? How did that face off in 1987? How was that de-escalated? What happened then? And any similarities, any lessons that we can draw from that?
Well, that's a good question, Jyoti. One can argue that before the current, impasse along India-China borders. The last occasion when we had heightened tension was, in 86, 87, following the Wangdung incident or, Sumdorong Chu incident. Just to recall some, basic facts for, information of your audience. We had a seasonal post in Sumdorong Chu Valley, which is south of Thagla Ridge. In June 1986, we discovered that the Chinese had occupied that post. We asked them to vacate. They didn't do that. Indeed, they set up a helipad there, and they sort of created permanent structures to stay put there. In response, we took fairly forceful measures. We, in fact, uh, airlifted a brigade worth of troops, which occupied Lungurola, Sulla, Tungla Ridge line, which is parallel to Thagla Ridge, and overlooking, Sumdorong Chu Valley and Namkha Chu Valley. Chinese were very upset about it. In fact, there were places where our posts were in very close proximity, and they called it a situation of close confrontation. In fact, in 1986 October, then US Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger had a meeting with Deng Xiaoping in Beijing, and he was reportedly told by Deng that China will teach India a lesson. That's the phraseology they had used before the invasion of Vietnam. And Weinberger, he transited through India and reportedly conveyed this message to India. And then situation became even more aggravated in February 1987 when we, created the state of Arunachal Pradesh. So we were in a difficult situation with borders becoming live on both sides, but we maintained our contacts through diplomatic channels and political channels. There was a confidential visit of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's special envoy, Mr. P.N. Huxer, to China in May 1987. Then External Affairs Minister, Mr. N.D. Tiwari, made a transit halt in Beijing in June 1987 on his way back from Pyongyang. As a result of these contacts, situation could be de-escalated, and the risk of a conflict breaking out was contained. And in fact, steps were taken which led to Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in December 1988, which led to a new paradigm being established for managing India-China relations. Subsequently, we had, a Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in September 1993. But, the problem of what Chinese call close confrontation between posts of two sides could be resolved only in 1995, 9 years later. And it, in fact, it was done at the level of diplomatic and military experts group, where I happened to be leading the Indian delegation. And we didn't accept the Chinese demand that we withdraw from Hathungla Lungurola Sulla ridgeline. In fact, we continued our patrolling and deployment as it was. Four minor posts, two on either side, were withdrawn, and that terminated the problem. But by that time, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, our situation had already been, contained in terms of risk of conflict. Now, if you wish to compare that experience with what's happening today,
Yes.
Today it's a more complex situation we are facing for a number of reasons. One, we are dealing with a China which is more aggressive, more assertive, especially about its so-called sovereignty-related claims, and also the capability gap between India and China has increased immensely since 1986-87. So we are dealing with a different situation. in 86, 87, China positioned itself as the aggrieved party.
Mhm,
Whereas this time, I think roles have been reversed because
mhm,
we are demanding that China should restore status quo ante. But still, I believe there are some lessons to be derived. One lesson that I would like to flag is need for strategic patience
mhm.
in dealing with Wangtung. You know, uh, we waited for 9 years. We maintained our position on the ground. We didn't concede Chinese demand that we vacate certain ridgeline south of Thagla. And finally, Chinese came around. So we didn't concede anything to the ground. This time again, even if it takes a long time, I think will have to maintain our demand that there should be restoration of status quo ante as of April, May 2020, at least in terms of patrolling, activities. There can be some joint patrolling as had happened earlier also. So I think that is an important area we need to maintain our position. Secondly, what we did in our handling of that particular crisis was to maintain channels of communication, especially through diplomatic and political channels. I referred to visit of then
PNX.
confidential visit of Mr. P. N. Aksar, visit of external affairs minister. So you know, bulk of the work was done at political and senior diplomatic level,
So you
though
would recommend,
eventually disengagement was worked out at a relatively lower level. I was the only director China at that time.
right?
Third point I would like to highlight, which is very important, that transparency was maintained at that time. There were discussions in Parliament. Uh, and what was happening was out in the public domain. This time, I think it has become a very polarized uh, political environment. It has become a divisive issue. So there is absence of transparency, which in a way is coming in the way, or sort of. It's not desirable. I think there's need for greater transparency. And the final lesson I would like to highlight is that uh, you need to deal with these problems. They can be contained. They can be addressed if you do it as part of a larger conversation rather than focusing too narrowly on matters like disengagement and de-escalation. I think that approach worked quite well in handling of Wangtung incident. In fact, crisis led to opportunity with a new paradigm of relationship being established, a very elaborate architecture of CBMs being put in place.
Right.
Perhaps they need, as I mentioned earlier, for a similar, broader dialogue between two countries,
Right. This is
without moving away from our position that there cannot be normalcy in relations as long as the situation along the borders remain abnormal, as External Affairs Minister Dr. Yashankar has repeatedly stated.
no, that's a fascinating suggestion, Ambassador. Basically, you're hoping to enlarge the conversation so that both sides can talk about a variety of issues. So, perhaps National Security Advisor Ajit Doval, who is the the special representative on India's side, perhaps he can, sort of reinitiate a conversation. But my question to you really is, why, for example, and that
Jyoti, if I can just make one point there, or maybe that conversation is going on. I don't know
yeah,
really
well,
because
right, we don't know exactly. Yes.
yes. So I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, we don't know
It's
that. But the question to
yeah.
you, Master, is that why is there no Chinese ambassador to India? I mean, it's been 15 months that the previous Chinese ambassador left, and there has been no successor. Isn't that interesting, especially in a time like this?
That's very disturbing. In fact, only Chinese side can answer why they've decided not to send an ambassador uh, to as important a position as New Delhi. Uh, Absence of a Chinese ambassador when we have an ambassador in Beijing clearly is a signal. and
What is the signal?
signal of, yeah, it's a signal of partly, unhappiness, whatever reason on their part, and partly also that, this this inclination to go the extra mile to address our concerns. They are pretending that mm, the new normal which has emerged along the borders, perfectly all right, we should accept it and move on. That's something we are unable to do, and for very good reasons.
Are you concerned that this hostility between India and China on the one hand and India and Pakistan on the other hand, are you concerned that there is the potential for a two-front hostility between these two neighbors of India?
Well, Jyoti, I mean, any defense planner in India will have to take into account this two front scenario. Uh, we always had a live line of control and international boundary with Pakistan. Though fortunately, since February 2021, ceasefire understanding is largely, essentially operational. But since 2020, India-China LAC, which was relatively quiet, uh, has become live,
Mhm.
and with escalated troop deployment on both sides. So we have to address a two-front scenario. There's no doubt about it. Uh, but I will not call it, a two-front uh, war or anything like that. You have to bear in mind the fact that during earlier conflicts, for instance, in 1965 with Pakistan, or Bangladesh War in 1971, or Kargil, in all these scenarios, China did not intervene militarily. The Chinese approach has been to build up Pakistan's capabilities, including in the strategic domain, nuclear and missile capabilities. But they have refrained from intervening directly, even though, in 1971, there was considerable pressure both from USA and Pakistan on China to step in. They didn't do that. But we cannot be complacent on this count because, as I mentioned earlier, we are dealing with a different China today, which is more assertive. Uh, so we have to prepare for a two-front scenario, uh, which I'm differentiating from two-front war. It's more in terms of, at present, a deterrence. I don't expect a war breaking out between India and China. In fact, Chinese approach has been more, to engage in what can be called a gray zone operations. Make tactical gains, which, when aggregated, lead to strategic change in situation
Right.
rather than all out conflict. So they're staying under the threshold of conflict, not only along India-China borders, but in other theaters they're involved in Taiwan Straits, in South China Sea, in East China
Right.
Sea. Though
Right.
there is certain pattern in Chinese behavior across these theaters.
Right. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but Ambassador Kantha, thank you so much for speaking to me on Awaz South Asia. Thank you for your time.